Okay, welcome to this virtual classroom. Right now we're going to talk a little bit about biogeochemical cycles. And a biogeochemical cycle describes the movement and transformation of the elements, chemical compounds, or other forms of matter through various Earth systems by physical and biological processes. And there are a number of biogeochemical processes. We're going to talk about the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle here today. But there's also the sulfur cycle, the silica cycle, the magnesia cycle, and a couple others that we won't go over, but you probably should just be aware of going forward. I think your book actually talks about the sulfur cycle in addition to the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles. And we actually talked about one biogeochemical cycle already, and that was the water cycle. And water goes through the environment just like carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, but we don't actually see it go through many transformations. You do see it being used by biological organisms, but at the end of the day, a water molecule basically stays the same. It doesn't get transformed into anything else other than just switched back and forth between its different phases of gas, liquid, and solid through the course of its own cycle. And these cycles are often repeatable and occur on all sorts of time scales, sometimes from a matter of minutes and seconds in some cases, but oftentimes as well, just as long as years, decades, centuries, millennia, even millions of years. So that's just something to keep in mind as we look at some of these. Is sometimes these elements are stored in some reservoirs for a very, very long time. And often it's presumed that many of these cycles are more or less in steady state. They exhibit little major change over time, unless, in the case that we're seeing right now, there's some sort of external environmental forcing factor, such as human burning of fossil fuels affecting the carbon cycle. And humans are affecting some of these other cycles as well, and we'll address that later on in this presentation. So I just want to go over the terminology briefly. I know we covered some of these words in class, but I wanted to highlight them again because they're important things to just keep in mind as we go forward and as you do your problem set and study for your exam. Reservoirs are places where an element is accumulated. And when we're talking about the water, the molecule water, that molecule is accumulated in the oceans, in lakes, in glaciers, and when we look at the cycle, we're looking at the rate of turnover of water in those particular reservoirs. And in terms of nitrogen, we're going to be looking at storage in the atmosphere, but also in soil and in plants. When we look at carbon, we're going to look at storage in the atmosphere and the oceans. And it's basically, again, where these elements are just stored in relation to other parts of the system at all. Flux is the transfer of an element from one reservoir to another. It's basically a process where things are exchanged, and this process can actually go both ways. So sometimes you can see the oceans exchanging gas with the atmosphere, gas being particularly oxygen and carbon dioxide, and those processes actually going both ways. So there's a flux into the atmosphere, out of the oceans of these gases, but also at times a flux out of the atmosphere and into the oceans of both these gases as well. Transformation is when the chemical form of an element is changed, and we'll address this particularly in the case of nitrogen. There's a couple very interesting biogeochemical processes that transform nitrogen into various useful forms that certain biological organisms use to build part of their structure or to use for energy. So let's start off reviewing some of the terrestrial carbon fluxes and transformations, and then we'll get on to the marine carbon fluxes and transformations. But we should remember that these are the processes that change carbon from one form to another or move it from one reservoir to another. We should be very familiar with the top two. Photosynthesis converts carbon dioxide into complex sugars. Respiration again converts those complex carbohydrates now back into carbon dioxide. We also see during this whole process, and what drives the transfer of carbon is this trophic transfer, and that's when carbon, typically stored in these complex carbons, such as carbohydrates, gets transferred between different trophic levels through acts of predation or eating vegetation. And so we see the carbon being transferred from plant to herbivore, from herbivore to carnivore, from carnivore towards the high predators. And through those processes, the carbon gets moved basically both as a chemical, but also at longer distances too. It allows for the physical movement of carbon in some cases, and in some cases actually settling in the soil eventually when plants, animals die or they excrete waste to form detritus. That is basically waste, dead organic matter that over time is decomposed by bacteria or fungi, which is another process of respiration, again converting these complex carbons back into carbon dioxide. See a whole bunch of physical movements, again, mostly by trophic transfers, but also driven by the water cycle, driven by some of this detritus flowing down streams into lakes or into the ocean. One major terrestrial carbon flux right now that we're really concerned about is the fossil fuel combustion. And what we're doing is we're taking carbon that's stored in a subterranean system outside of the active biogeochemical carbon cycle and putting that carbon into the atmosphere by burning it and converting that stored carbon, those complex petroleum products, burning those petroleum products and converting those complex carbons into carbon dioxide. Now, you should note that we're talking about different forms of carbon here. So typically when we talk about our biogeochemical cycles and our fluxes, we refer to pools of a specific element, and obviously in this case it's carbon. Just keep in mind as we consider these elements in different pools or different reservoirs that they typically take on one or even several chemical forms that might be a little bit different than what we're used to when we're just saying carbon. So that's just, an important thing to just distinguish and think about going forward. So now on to marine carbon fluxes. So between the oceans and the atmospheres, there's this air-sea exchange that basically pushes CO2 in and out of the atmosphere and in and out of the ocean. And there are different physical processes that drive this. But what you need to know is that basically CO2 is both going in the ocean and coming out of it. There are these processes that exchange it, and they happen at pretty equal rates. But there are slight differences, small differences that have important impacts down the line. So carbon dioxide as a gas in the atmosphere dissolves in the ocean, and it becomes basically a dissolved gas. Well, that dissolved gas then reacts with water to form carbonic acid. So you've probably heard of the term carbon dioxide is an acid gas. This is what we mean. This is you're basically creating this molecule that actually has a degree of acidity to it. And you see that in the ocean, this carbonic acid actually breaks up and releases a couple protons, lowering the pH of the ocean when you add more and more carbon dioxide to it. We're going to talk about this in a second, but just keep this in mind as we move forward. Again, part of actually this carbonate system drives photosynthesis in the ocean. Photosynthesis is now both dependent in the ocean on that dissolved CO2 gas, but also on this bicarbonate, HCO3- ion that drives the production of more complex carbons in marine phytoplankton, in these small singular cellular plants or small bacteria that have chlorophyll in them to basically convert the sunlight to energy and produce these complex energy storage units. Now, we remember that these complex energy storage units, complex sugars, are used by both the plants, by both the algae, and higher organisms that feed on the algae, feed on these phytoplankton, and drive this whole process now of respiration or releasing this chemical energy. And that process, again, releases CO2 now exchanging back into the ocean. And through this whole respiration process, you see that, again, there are levels of trophic transfer of carbon from your chlorophyll, your photosynthetic organisms, all the way up to your higher animals and your apex animals, sharks or whales or whatever. And then driving also the movement of carbon. Remember, when we talked about in class, there are several oceans that we typically talk about. The two main ones are the surface ocean, but also the deep ocean. And the ocean conveyor belt drives the movement of carbon from the surface ocean then down into the deep ocean. You also have this other process of detritus and dead organic matter basically raining down or snowing down into the ocean and bringing that carbon down into the deep ocean. So this is a figure from your book that basically lays out some of these transfers, some of these fluxes between reservoirs. I suggest you take a look at this one, the one in the in your book as well. I think it's actually the same thing. Talk about this one for a bit because we are going to be using it in our case study. And this is basically the same thing as the previous slide, but shows it more in a schematic, what we call a box model form. Your boxes are your reservoirs. Your arrows between them are your fluxes. And so we see that the atmosphere is exchanging carbon dioxide with the surface water, but also some terrestrial ecosystems such as short-lived biota. Those are your land plants and ultimately your animals, but also that short-lived biota gets moved on to longer-lived biota, and that you can think of as your forests, your old-growth forests, your trees that have been around typically for hundreds of years. And that's kind of why we start looking at this arrow right here, which is currently 0, but you're going to be looking at this again and seeing if this changes. This deforestation flux. As you may know, there are a number of areas in the world, such as the Amazon rainforest, such as Southeast Asia, where a lot of forests are being clear cut very rapidly to make way for land, farmland normally, but other land as well. And this process of deforestation actually releases a significant amount of carbon into the atmosphere in relation to the fossil fuels, which you will explore in this exercise. So when the biota dies, it basically becomes the litter, the detritus on let's say a forest floor, or basically making up the dead layer of organic matter above our soil. And that organic matter eventually gets settled in the soil, which oftentimes could also be peat, which is think of a swampland, or the same thing happening in a swampland. On the other side, back in the marine, the sea, we see again this air-sea exchange with carbon dioxide, and a flux of primary production, but also a flux of respiration and decomposition within these surface waters. And then we also see an exchange through this flux of about 38 gigatons through these physical processes, such as the ocean conveyor belt, or through, again, marine snow detritus, and that's this flux of about 4 gigatons of carbon each year going down to the deep ocean. This is another picture of what what the carbon cycle looks like. Again, I think it's another good, more graphical representation that really helps you think about what's going on, especially in terms of photosynthesis and respiration in both terrestrial and marine systems, and where this carbon is going and cycling through these different reservoirs. But take a minute to just talk about what's happening in the oceans, specifically in regard to this bicarbonate system. And as we pump more greenhouse gases, specifically actually as we pump more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we pump, again, through these cycles, more carbon dioxide into our oceans. And that has a negative effect of lowering the pH of the oceans, or increasing the acidity or number of hydrogen ions in the ocean. This just basically shows this movement of carbon dioxide from the atmospheric phase to the gas phase, and then moving from left to right, you basically can follow the process of acidification. As you increase the carbon dioxide, it creates this carbonic acid, and that releases hydrogen ions, and eventually a little bit more bicarbonate and carbonate ions. And that actually makes this a process a certain biological process really difficult. And if you notice these organisms right here, these are, I think, your big mussels. These are your nautiluses. You're basically shell-producing aquatic organisms. These little organisms right here are the ones that look almost like that have these 4 discs on them. Those are actually an organism that I studied during my graduate work called Emiliana huxleyi, and they're what's called a coccolithophore. They produce these intricate calcium carbonate exoskeletons. They're single-celled phytoplankton that photosynthesize, but they also produce these carbonate shells effectively. And you'll notice that this picture is basically showing that as we increase our acidity, again from left to right, it actually becomes harder and harder for these organisms to produce these calcium carbonate shells. And that's because these calcium carbonate shells basically dissolve in acidic environments. And so the driving of the oceans to become more acidic makes it harder for these organisms to produce the cells which are essential to their ecological niche in the ocean. This is just a graph of what's showing what's happening with the chemistry here. You notice on the bottom axis we have our pH going from acidic to basic. On the top axis we actually have ratios of concentrations of these different forms of carbonate or carbon in the ocean. Inorganic carbon is actually a word we use for this system. And you'll notice that as we go down and become more acidic, going from this pH of about 8.1 to a pH of 7.9, we actually lower our carbonate concentration. This is the black line. This is CO3 2-, significantly. And it's the carbonate that these calcium carbonate producing organisms, these calcifying organisms, like to use to produce their shells. So they have less and less of it available to them in more acidic conditions, making it harder for them to produce their and this is just a graph of what's been happening actually over the past 100 or 200 or so years in surface pH. And it basically shows that in some parts of the ocean it's actually more of a problem in others, but you can see that overall we basically move down on average about a half to about 1/10 of a pH unit. And that doesn't sound like much, but that's really, really significant. The oceans have not experienced a change in pH this rapid in a long time, and when it has, it's usually been associated with extinction events. So this is a primary area of concern for a number of different industries, such as shellfish industries, not only clams and mussels, but stuff like lobster. And it's also a concern for fisheries who feed off some of the basis, for fisheries that grow in which fish need some of these other lower organisms, some of these other calcifying organisms. They need those organisms to thrive and survive. So this is one thing that is called the other carbon problem, and is often overlooked by the media, by a lot of people when we talk about the releasing of greenhouse gases. It's not only the warming of the planet, but it's also the fundamental change in chemistry of the Earth's oceans. And it's not just acidity as well, it's a number of other aspects of it that I might talk about at a date. But just again to highlight these points, there's a number of different calcifying organisms in the ocean. On the right, you'll see a number of these calcareous phytoplankton. And these are organisms that produce, again, these really intricate, and these are electron microscopy photos of these organisms. I worked with Emiliana huxleyi, the one in the top row, the third one in the top row, and they just produce these beautiful these cellular walls that just have these very intricate designs and patterns. But you're probably a little bit more familiar with corals, and corals are another form of calcifying organism that is highly threatened by both temperature and changing pH. Oh, this is a great image just showing the change in the calcification process of Emiliana huxleyi with increasing pH. You can see that these, what we call coccoliths, these shells that this organism produce, become much more different in shape and size and design as the pH increases. We're not entirely sure what this means for this organism quite yet, but it's pretty significant and it's pretty concerning. And these are some very small organisms. I think that this image was taken with a microscope. Again, stuff that you can't see with your naked eye easily. These might be just about grain size, but they're these shells that protect certain animals that live in the ocean that are just going to be very difficult for these organisms to make in a more acidic environment, and that opens these organisms up to predation and other challenges. So let's move on to the nitrogen cycle, and this is a graph figure from your book. Definitely take a look at it. It does a great job showing the fluxes and the reservoirs. Again, very similar to what we think as in relation to our reservoirs in the carbon cycle. You see that a lot of the nitrogen is actually in the form of this gas, N2, gaseous nitrogen, in the atmosphere. Now, the interesting thing about this gas is it's actually a very inert molecule, and biology actually has a very hard time using this gas. And so there's actually very little movement overall of this nitrogen biological fixation of nitrogen gas, movement of it out of the atmosphere. There's not much of this gas is taken out of the atmosphere for biological purposes. Most of the nitrogen that we're concerned about it definitely moves much more in terrestrial and marine systems through a number of other different processes, which we'll move on now. But let's just keep our perspective here and realize that nitrogen is required for a number of different cellular processes and just the movement of life. In particular, you'll recall that nitrogen is essential for amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins and enzymes, but also nucleic acid and chlorophyll, driving photosynthesis. Now, you should be able to start to connect now sort of human actions in this and realize that nitrogen is necessary for the growth of agriculture, for farming, for even in some fisheries, we need to add a little bit of extra nitrogen into it to get it to grow. And so agriculture is a way that humans are actually changing the nitrogen cycle pretty significantly as well. I mean, usually when we think of global change of these cycles, we think of climate change. This is also happening with nitrogen as well. And it happens because we are basically fertilizing our cropland with nitrogen because our plants need nitrogen to grow and they don't have enough of it in the soil. So we add excess nitrogen to our soil to basically grow plants. Only some of that nitrogen actually that's assimilated in the plants. A lot of it actually gets pushed into rivers and pushed down into, especially in the Mississippi, eventually goes into the ocean. And at the mouth of the Mississippi, as we talked about in class, we have this huge dead zone where the nitrogen, as well as the phosphorus, is basically fertilizing the growth of a lot of phytoplankton, but that growth is causing the explosion of oxygen consuming bacteria, creating these dead zones. So it's one thing we need to keep in mind, our use of nitrogen. Now, there are several different transformation and fluxes of nitrogen that you should be aware of going forward. As I mentioned, not a lot of nitrogen is taken out of the atmosphere. Taken out of this N2 gaseous molecular form of nitrogen. But there's this very interesting process that's actually run by certain bacteria. In some cases, a cyanobacteria, in other cases, symbiotic bacteria and legumes. Legumes are plants such as beans, stuff that have actual nodules in their roots, which these bacteria grow in. And they take up nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert that to ammonia or other nitrates that the plant then takes up and uses in its own biological processes. Lightning is actually a minor source of the conversion of nitrogen gas into ammonia and other forms of nitrogen. But then there's this industrial process, this Haber process of converting nitrogen gas under high heat and pressure into ammonia. And again, this is how we get our fertilizer. is through this actual process that uses a lot of energy, a lot of fossil fuels to get the fertilizer, the nitrogen in the form that we needed to fertilize our plants and drive our agricultural systems. This other process is another process is nitrification now, the conversion of this ammonia into a nitrate ion, NO3. It's typically done by anaerobic bacteria. This denitrification process occurs now in the absence of oxygen, so it's driven by anaerobic bacteria that like to take that oxygen from that nitrate and convert the nitrogen then into nitrogen gas. Ammonification is the process of taking organic nitrogen stored as amino acids or nucleic acids, and converting that to ammonia. Combustion takes releases some sort of nitrogens as well, and when we think of fossil fuels, we think of mostly it being stored carbon, but there's actually a lot of nitrogen in our fossil fuels, and that combustion process produces what's called nitric oxides, NOxes. You might have heard of SO2 and NOxes. NOxes are these nitrogens that are oxidized nitrogens that are released during the combustion process and end up in the atmosphere and can eventually cause acid rain. Now, as humans, we actually waste a lot of a product called urea, and that ends up in our wastewater system. That's a nitrogen-containing compound that ends up in our wastewater system. That is something that we need to, when we treat our water coming out of our homes and our factories, we need to make sure that we take care of that water and take care of the nitrogen in there, treat it effectively before we send that nitrogen off into the environment. But that can also be considered a minor flux as the nitrogen that we produce throughout our daily routine. So the first thing you should notice with the phosphorus cycle that differs from the other cycles we have previously discussed, water, carbon, nitrogen, is the fundamental lack of phosphorus in the atmosphere. And phosphorus doesn't like to exist in a gaseous form. So you actually see very little of it transferred by the atmosphere, and the amount that's transferred by dust or sea spray is actually pretty insignificant. Your focus should be that phosphate is often stored in geological formations, which we'll talk about in a bit, and weathering processes usually release that phosphorus. It's got to come from somewhere, and so it's typically stored in these rocks and ultimately ends up buried in deep in the ocean. But it's very similar processes on the Earth and then in the ocean that drive the cycling and movement of phosphorus from basically being stored in the soil and being uptaken by plants, and those plants being consumed by higher organisms, and then eventually being cycled through processes of detritus or transport or eventually movement through various reservoirs. So you'll notice, you should recall that phosphorus is required for nucleic acids. The nucleotide polyphosphates such as ATP, which is used for energy and cellular respiration. It's also critical for cell membrane lipids, but also pretty important for bones. I know we didn't really talk about it, but we need phosphorus in our bones to help build a structure. And since phosphorus has such an important biological requirement, and it's often found depleted in agricultural soils, we actually have to add it as fertilizer. So keep this in mind. Again, we see the same problems with runoff and from agricultural lands into streams, and eventually create dead zones at the mouths of river like the Mississippi and the Chesapeake Bay. Phosphorus has to come from somewhere, and we know there's not a lot of it in the atmosphere. So what we typically do is rely on phosphorus mines, and phosphorus mines are often located on islands where there have been a lot of birds who like to stop over, take a break, and then deposit a store of phosphorus before they move on and fly elsewhere. And these are basically what's called guano deposits, or the waste of certain bird species that accumulate in these locations over over long periods of time and basically form phosphate, mineral deposits that we can then, this is an example of a phosphate mine, I think, on one of these islands. Again, this element's critical for agriculture, so we will go to islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean for this and dig very deep for it.